In this episode, we're going to take the idea of indicators and turn it into a disciplined decision skill, because indicators can either sharpen your focus or overwhelm you if you treat them all the same. When beginners first encounter threat work, it is easy to assume that every suspicious artifact is a high-priority clue, and it is also easy to assume that collecting more indicators automatically makes you safer. Real environments do not work that way, because you will always have more possible indicators than time, and attackers also benefit when defenders chase noise. The skill you need is Triage, which is a repeatable way to decide what deserves attention right now, what should be watched for context, and what can be set aside without guilt. When Triage is done well, it makes threat intelligence, TI, feel calmer and more defensible, because you can explain why you focused on certain signals and why you did not. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To triage well, you first need a clear picture of what an indicator really is, because the word is often used loosely in conversation. An indicator is a piece of observable information that might point toward malicious activity, such as a domain, an address, a file attribute, an account behavior pattern, or a combination of events that tends to occur together. The important word is might, because an indicator is rarely a conclusion by itself. Some indicators are direct evidence of something that happened, while others are only hints that require context to interpret. Beginners often treat indicators as if they are the main output, but in disciplined work, indicators are inputs that must be evaluated and positioned inside a story that supports a decision. Once you accept that indicators are candidates rather than verdicts, triage becomes a natural next step rather than an optional extra. A second foundation is recognizing that triage is not the same as dismissal, because many new analysts equate setting something aside with taking a risk. In reality, triage is what allows you to take the right risks consciously, instead of taking the wrong risks accidentally through overload. If you try to treat every indicator as urgent, your attention fragments, your reasoning becomes shallow, and you start missing meaningful patterns because you are busy processing trivia. Triage protects you from that failure mode by creating a controlled way to defer low-value items while reserving deep attention for high-value ones. This is why triage is a quality skill as much as a speed skill, because it prevents the team from creating false urgency around weak signals. When triage is routine, you can move quickly without becoming sloppy, because your speed comes from priorities rather than from shortcuts. The first real triage question is relevance, because an indicator that is truly malicious can still be irrelevant to the question you are trying to answer. If your current requirement is focused on a particular type of threat, a particular set of assets, or a particular time window, indicators outside that scope may not deserve immediate attention. Beginners often feel pulled by external headlines or dramatic claims, but relevance keeps your work anchored to what your stakeholders actually need. Relevance also includes environment fit, meaning whether the indicator even makes sense in your context, such as whether you use the technologies it targets or have exposure in the places it assumes. A disciplined triage decision can be as simple as saying this does not connect to the current requirement, so it will be parked until the requirement changes. That kind of restraint is a sign of maturity, not a sign that you are ignoring threats. Once relevance is established, credibility becomes the next filter, because not all indicators are backed by the same quality of evidence. An indicator observed directly in your environment often starts with higher credibility because it is grounded in something you can verify, like a recorded event or an artifact tied to a system you manage. An indicator copied from an external post might still be valuable, but credibility depends on whether that source explains how the indicator was obtained and whether the claim is supported by artifacts rather than by confident language. Beginners sometimes treat repetition as validation, but many repeated indicators are simply copied from one original claim, which creates the illusion of corroboration without independence. Credibility also includes recognizing when a source is mixing observation and interpretation, because an indicator presented as a fact might actually be a hypothesis. When you train yourself to ask where this came from and how we know, you stop giving weak indicators a free pass in a high-priority workflows. Another essential triage lens is specificity, because specificity determines whether an indicator helps you distinguish malicious activity from normal background activity. Some indicators are so broad that they match ordinary behavior constantly, which means acting on them creates noise and fatigue rather than clarity. Even if attackers sometimes use broad patterns, defenders cannot treat every match as meaningful without drowning in false positives. More specific indicators can be more actionable because they narrow the set of possible explanations, but specificity alone is not enough if you do not understand what the indicator represents. A very specific indicator might be tied to a one-time experiment, a benign service, or a transient artifact that has no lasting relevance. This is why good triage considers whether the indicator actually discriminates between competing explanations. If it does not help you choose between plausible stories, it might be interesting, but it is not yet high intelligence value. Timeliness is the next filter, and it matters because indicators have shelf lives, sometimes very short ones. Infrastructure and artifacts can change quickly, especially when adversaries adapt, rotate resources, or abandon what has been exposed. Beginners often treat an indicator as permanently meaningful once they see it in a report, but stale indicators can clutter your attention and mislead your sense of what is active. Timeliness is not just about the date a report was published. It is about when the indicator was observed, how long it stayed active, and whether there is any sign it remains relevant. Some indicators are naturally fleeting, while others, like durable behavior patterns, may remain useful longer because they reflect habits rather than specific resources. A disciplined triage habit asks what time window this indicator belongs to and whether that window overlaps with your current requirement. When timeliness is made explicit, you avoid spending today's limited effort on yesterday's problem. A powerful but often overlooked part of triage is deciding whether an indicator is best treated as an action trigger or as a pivot point. An action trigger is something you treat as immediately meaningful in your environment, often because it is credible, specific, and tied to meaningful assets or behaviors. A pivot point is something you follow to discover related information, such as associated infrastructure, related activity, or corroborating evidence that can strengthen or weaken a hypothesis. Beginners sometimes force every indicator into an action decision, like treat it as malicious or ignore it. But that binary mindset wastes the true value of many indicators. Some indicators are too weak to justify action, but are perfect for exploration when combined with a testable hypothesis. The triage decision then becomes whether following the pivot is likely to reduce uncertainty. This is where triage connects directly to disciplined analysis, because it turns indicators into purposeful next steps rather than reactive churn. Another triage dimension is environmental impact, but it must be handled carefully so it does not turn into panic-driven prioritization. If an indicator touches a high-value system, a privileged account, or a sensitive workflow, it may deserve attention even if confidence is not yet high. At the same time, impact is not proof, and it should never be used to inflate certainty about what the indicator means. Beginners sometimes assume that anything involving important assets must be an intrusion, when it could also be routine administration, automation, or a misconfiguration. A disciplined approach treats impact as a reason to allocate attention, not as a reason to skip evidence evaluation. You are essentially saying the cost of being wrong could be high, so we will investigate or monitor more closely. When you keep impact and confidence separate, your triage becomes rational instead of emotional. It is also important to understand that indicator value is often about context density, meaning how much useful surrounding information you have with the indicator. A domain with no additional context might be a weak clue, while the same domain paired with timestamps, involved hosts, associated accounts, and related behaviors becomes a much stronger thread. Beginners often focus on the indicator itself and forget that the real value comes from the story around it. Context density is one reason internal observations can be powerful, because they often carry built-in surrounding details. It is also a reason external indicators sometimes disappoint, because you may receive only a bare artifact with no explanation of how it was seen. In disciplined triage, low-context indicators are not automatically discarded, but they are weighted cautiously until context is added. This prevents you from overreacting to artifacts that have not yet earned significance. Another pitfall triage helps you avoid is treating indicator count as a measure of seriousness, because volume can be misleading. High counts may indicate that an indicator is broad or noisy, not that an adversary is launching a massive campaign against you. Low counts may indicate that an indicator is rare and therefore potentially meaningful, especially if it is specific and tied to valuable assets. The right question is not how many hits occurred, but what those hits look like, where they cluster, and whether they align with a plausible threat story. Beginners often feel comforted by numbers because numbers feel objective, but without context, numbers can amplify bias. A disciplined triage mindset uses counts as one input, then asks what patterns the counts represent. When you focus on patterns rather than volume, you become better at separating true signal from background noise. Good triage also includes an awareness of duplication and dependency, because repeated appearances of the same indicator do not always mean independent confirmation. An indicator might be repeated across multiple sources because they are copying each other, or because they all rely on the same upstream provider or the same original claim. That kind of repetition is not true corroboration, and treating it as corroboration can inflate confidence incorrectly. In triage, you want to know whether you are seeing independent observations or a single claim echoed multiple times. Independence matters because it reduces the chance that you are being misled by a shared error or by a coordinated narrative. Beginners often do not think about independence because it is invisible unless you ask, but professional triage habits make it visible. When you track whether evidence is independent, you make better decisions about what deserves escalation and what deserves verification first. A disciplined triage process also requires you to be clear about what kind of follow-up an indicator deserves, because attention is not one-size-fits-all. Some indicators deserve validation work, meaning you gather additional evidence to confirm what the indicator represents in your environment. Some indicators deserve monitoring, meaning you watch for associated behaviors or for clustering that increases confidence over time. Some indicators deserve escalation, meaning you bring them to a higher priority workflow because the combination of credibility, relevance, and potential impact justifies faster coordination. Other indicators deserve deprioritization, meaning they are documented but not actively pursued unless new information changes the picture. Beginners often jump straight to the strongest reaction because it feels safer, but that can waste effort and disrupt normal operations unnecessarily. A professional triage mindset matches the follow-up to the evidence strength and the decision stakes. That matching is what keeps triage from becoming either reckless or timid. As triage becomes more natural, you start to see that it is a continuous loop rather than a one-time decision. An indicator that is low value today can become high value later when a new requirement emerges or when new evidence connects it to meaningful behavior. Likewise, an indicator that seems valuable at first can lose value when you discover it is common noise or based on weak sourcing. This is why triage is tied to review and feedback, because you learn over time which kinds of indicators consistently produce real intelligence value. Beginners often treat triage as a gate you pass through once, but mature teams treat it as a living filter that adapts as new information arrives. This also helps reduce regret, because setting something aside is not a permanent decision. It is a decision based on the current evidence and priorities. When triage is treated as revisable, it becomes easier to stay disciplined under pressure. To bring everything together, true intelligence value is the result of indicators being placed in context, evaluated with evidence discipline, and connected to decisions rather than to curiosity. You triage by asking whether the indicator is relevant to the requirement, credible in its sourcing and support, specific enough to discriminate, timely enough to matter, and rich enough in context to justify attention. You also decide whether it should trigger action, serve as a pivot for exploration, or remain as a documented thread awaiting more evidence. You keep impact considerations separate from certainty so you do not confuse importance with proof, and you protect yourself from false corroboration by watching for duplication and lack of independence. When you do all of this, triage becomes a force multiplier because it makes limited time feel sufficient. That disciplined foundation is what you will rely on next as you learn how to pivot from domains to infrastructure with intent. expanding outward from a chosen indicator without turning exploration into chaos.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.